Our final session features a pair of Pulitzer Prize winning reporters who have worked investigations together for the Associated Press for plus minus 20 years. Please meet Margie Mason and Robin McDowell, our 2025 winners of the Collier Prize. Margie and Robin began their work together in Southeast Asia. In Asia, their reporting exposed slavery in the seafood industry, resulting in more than 2,000 men being freed, as well as labor abuses on palm oil plantations. Back in the United States, they exposed how massive companies were profiting from prison labor, a project that won the 2025 Collier Prize for State Government Accountability. Their work has led to convictions, U.S. laws being changed, bans on certain foreign imports, and U.S. companies changing their purchasing policy. Margie, Robin, come on up.
Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. First off, we just want to thank the University of Florida for hosting this event and for bringing us here. We also want to thank Nathan Collier for his belief in what we are doing, all of us, and his generosity in supporting investigative journalism and the kind of work that we are all continuing to try to do. I think what we really want to do is have more of a conversation. As Rick just said, Robin and I have worked together really, it was 2003, but 2005 is when we really started working together in Southeast Asia. And I think for you to understand, can you guys hear me? I think for you to really understand the journey that brought us to this project, you have to understand a little bit about where we were in the past and how we got here. And Rick talked about some of our other projects, but we really, as women, there were a few of us in Southeast Asia when we were there. We gravitated toward each other, started doing more and more work, started doing investigative work, and really digging in Indonesia. She was in Burma. We found this slave island through a lot of hard work and worked on that story, connecting the dots back with the seafood that was being caught by enslaved fishermen. We connected those dots back to American companies. And that really started our journey into supply chain reporting. And that project then went into the palm oil project, which again, we started looking at this, massive industry in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, two biggest palm oil producers. Again, we're following the money, we're following where this palm oil is going and how it's ending up everywhere in everything that we are eating in America. And then during the pandemic.
And everything else, cosmetics, paint, rubber, there's almost nothing that you can't find palm oil in.
So then we kind of thought, all right, we're done with the supply chain, following things. We're going to do something different. We moved back to the U.S. after being overseas for
30 years for me.
Almost 20 for me. And then it was during the pandemic that we started writing. We were doing criminal justice stories, and we started writing about prisoners, and they were being forced to work while most other Americans were being told to stay home and protect themselves and protect the public. And they were being forced to make things like hand sanitizer and face masks. And we were wondering, how could this be happening? Are there certain standards for them that are different than for the rest of the American workforce? And that's where we started really kind of digging in a little bit on that. And then we were, started seeing these photos, old photos we thought, of people working on these, former slave plantations in the South. And then we started digging into that a little bit and realizing that, these pictures were actually more modern, and this is today. And they're still working on these former slave plantations. They are making, pennies or nothing at all in many cases. And importantly, if they refuse to work, they could be punished. And they could be sent to solitary confinement. They could have, lose all their privileges. A whole lot of things could happen. And I think at that point we were kind of like, wait, we kind of know this story. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because some of our sources, when we were doing the work in Asia, mm-hmm. we had one guy in particular in the palm oil industry who was really kind of critical, and he was like, you guys really need to be looking at what's going on in the US because you're not doing much better than we are on some of this stuff, right? And so at that point we were like, well, maybe we should do part 3 and turn everything around and focus it, use the skill set that we've developed over the past decade and focus it on what is happening in the United States to this very vulnerable population. It's the same theme. These are people who are behind these walls that we drive by every day, and we don't know what's going on there, right? And I think we started asking ourselves, how is this happening in the United States? And how is it that no one knows, much about this? And how do we really kind of dig in and get at this reporting in a way that no one else has done?
Right. So, and as part of that, I think people are aware and know about prison labor. From time to time, there have been stories that said, for instance, Victoria's Secret was producing some of the things it was making in prisons. And it usually was kind of one-off stories or one-off companies, and then there would often be a reaction. The company would cut the ties. But we decided, okay, well, it was actually Margie that called and said, okay, let's focus on agriculture. She often has the light bulb idea where it's like, this is the thing that can make it different. And we decided, let's make this a national project and use agriculture as a through line, because that is really the clearest way to tell the story about how we got here, from slavery to convict leasing to, as laws changed and morphed, basically prison populations today. And as those prison populations swell, it really has become a big, massive business. And while agriculture represents a small portion of really what is being produced behind bars, it is something that could make Americans, we thought, understand, why is this important? Why should we care? So that is what we did. We had problems, as you can imagine, getting access to the prisons, but as any reporter knows who covers the criminal justice system, you can speak to prisoners, you can phone them, you can email them, but because we did not want to put anyone in danger, we also relied on information that we already had. And Margie will go into a little bit about that, but I want to say, she mentioned the photographs, and since that was something that really struck us, we wanted to show kind of the story through time. And there were 3 photographers in particular, and also several AP reporters who had photographed prisoners working in the fields in the South in the 70s, 80s, and then up until the 2000s in the case of the AP reporters. And I just want to call out their names because pictures were so remarkable. Bruce Jackson, Keith Calhoun, and Chandra McCormick had just a huge stockpile of photographs, and it's something they had spotted years ago, and really couldn't believe it themselves. And they were generous enough to let us use their pictures, and in many cases we could kind of show the pictures from the past and to the present to show this is really not changed at all. So that really made a big difference, I think, in what we were able to do, because of course you can't get cameras video into the prisons today very often, and it was hard to get today's shots, but we could get them up until a few years ago.
And really, I think with those pictures, I mean, they were Bruce's pictures went back to the 1960s, right? So we had, I mean, we went through thousands of his pictures because he had this amazing access in Arkansas and Texas, right? And then, you know, Keith and Chandra, I think he did 60s and 70s, and then they had stuff from the 80s going up from Angola, which is the Louisiana penitentiary that we've all heard about, state penitentiary. And, you know, I think that early on, we're big into history. Like, we think history, I mean, for all of our stories, we always try to get some history in there, because you have to understand where you are and where we're going. You have to understand the past, I think. And so for this story, it was really interesting, and we're so happy that our editors agreed to let us do this, because so often, you know, you write, you always try to put that nugget of history in there, and it's the thing that gets cut. It's like, this has got to go. We got to shorten this. The history's going. And we really kind of said, look, we're going to do this project, and it's going to be very different than the normal investigative project. And we really want history to be one of the main characters. Like, we want to use history and have that be a part of the narrative that kind of, you know, you can string through all. I think we had 5 stories, and the history was in all of it. And we'd done a podcast earlier looking at convict leasing and the 13th Amendment. And so the 13th Amendment, after slavery, abolished, you know, slavery except as punishment for a crime. And that clause became the basis for convict leasing that occurred, you know, largely in the South after emancipation, where they were able to just go around and round up, you know, mostly young black men for, you know, these crimes that were minimal, if they were crimes at all, right? And then companies, the states would lease these men, mostly men, out to the companies. And so they were working in the coal mines. They were building the railroads. They were doing turpentine here in, wasn't it turpentine here?
Yeah, turpentine. They basically were building America, rebuilding America after the Civil War.
And it was for people like, you know, Andrew Carnegie, and you know, I mean, it was these
Milton, yeah.
It was these big, you know, iconic industrialists, largely from the North, but they were doing this, and it was this legal cover that was provided through this clause in the 13th Amendment. And then as we kind of started looking more at this, it's like, well, over the years, the laws just kind of morphed and changed as mass incarceration, as the prisons got bigger and bigger and bigger. And we all know about the business that's connected to our prisons, right? And so what we really wanted to do was dig in and understand how companies were profiting off of this, and then use the history, and again, as she said earlier, the agriculture, right? It was the through line that took us all the way back to emancipation to today, because you still have all of these guys who are out in the fields, you know, in some cases forced to hand pick vegetables.
They're in like triple digit heat. They don't get breaks. They are punished often when they refuse. They can be thrown into solitary confinement. They can't strike. They can't form unions. So all these things that, you know, big American companies are basically allowing the use of this labor that they would never get away with if they were outside of prison walls.
So then we were like, okay, how do we get at this, right? We're looking at this from a national perspective. How do we do this? And we decided, okay, we're going to need to FOIA all 50 states. So we FOIA'd the Department of Corrections in all 50 states. And some states were really forthcoming. Like, we were asking for the contracts. Who are you doing business with? Tell us. And we were very specific. We wanted to know, we asked them a whole lot of questions, but we wanted to know about like agriculture contracts, especially with the big states like Texas and Arkansas, Louisiana. Those states still do a lot of ag stuff where they're selling stuff all over the place. But then also,
and often buying directly. In those cases, they're often buying directly from the prison. So there were like 3 different ways you could look at supply chain tracking. It's the direct buyers, the third-party suppliers, or things like work release, or sometimes because the supply chains are so murky, it can be third or fourth party suppliers, and we'll get into that a little bit too.
So we filed the FOIAs, and we found that, some states were very forthcoming, some states were not forthcoming. And so then we decided, okay, one of the things that we have done successfully in the past is when we need to find something and we need to document the supply chain going from point A to point B to point C, you can always use records, and we've in the past we've used customs data to really help us, especially finding say the palm oil or the fish that were those shipments coming in from overseas. But in this particular case, we were like, okay, well, there's no import records, but we've also had a lot of success in the past following trucks, literally putting boots on the ground. And I think that that's something that a whole lot of reporters today, there's limited budgets, there's limited time, that is a big investment. But it's something that was essential to this project. And I'll let Robin,
and we also like doing it.
So it's her favorite thing to do. And if I end up doing it and she's not there, I have to put it on the FaceTime so that she can feel like she's with me.
That's true.
Right? Because she gets so excited about it.
Although it's not always exciting. It can be very boring. In this case, because we were focusing on the South, agriculture, the South was the obvious place to really look at. And I was living in Minnesota at the time and had to keep driving down to the South, which was like a long drive, or spend time in an Airbnb or whatever way we could kind of get the most for our money, because we didn't really have a lot of money for that.
We do everything on a shoestring. All the investigations that we've done,
we figure out ways to make it work. So in this
money.
case, I rented out my house and took that money and then initially rented out Airbnbs in Louisiana so that I could stay for a couple months at a time, and eventually just full-on moved there because the project took a little over 2 years, and we needed a base in the South. It seemed kind of ridiculous to try to cover agriculture from Minnesota and West Virginia. So this is an aerial view of Angola Prison, which became the lead of our main story. It is the size of Manhattan. It was a former slave plantation, one of the biggest in the South. And the conditions there are really terrible. I mean, this is someplace where the workers really are, basically have keeled over in the fields. They've refused to work. They've been tear gassed or clubbed and brought into solitary confinement over the years. So there were a lot of stories. As I mentioned earlier, we didn't want to rely too much on men who were currently incarcerated because we didn't want to get them into trouble. And that really was something that especially in Louisiana, we'd already had several examples of other reporters who had spoken to prisoners, and then they ended up getting into big trouble. So we ended up talking. Louisiana has a very strong community of formerly incarcerated workers, talked a lot to them. And then also family members of people who survived, or when people died, their family members spoke to us quite often. So in the end, I think we spoke to over 120 people.
Yeah.
This is the gate of Angola, Louisiana State Penitentiary. Spent a lot of time just sitting in a truck outside waiting for shipments to come out. We did have a couple sources of people who could tell us when they thought agriculture products were going to leave, and that included cattle, so we knew about the time frame of various crops. But it could take days and nothing would happen, and then it was come back in a week or come back in 2 weeks. Eventually, there was a shipment of cattle, 80 cattle in 3 trucks that left, and I called Margie, like, okay, we got it. Of course, once you start following a truck, you don't know where it's going to go. It could just go to some local, like local market or local auction house is what happened in this case. It went to some place called Dominique's Auction. And then we watched all those cattle be bought by a very wealthy Louisiana rancher. And then a couple days later, he sent them to Texas, followed that truck 600 miles, those trucks 600 miles to the auction house where Margie met me. And then we were able to find out by talking to the owner of the slaughterhouse who buys this stuff. She was very forthcoming. It was pretty much everyone: Burger King, Sam's Club, McDonald's, Tyson Foods, Cargill. So this was kind of a really great example of how murky the supply chains are and how hard it is to actually find out who's buying this stuff. In this case, and we've seen this in other cases as well, they were also exporting. So for us, this was a big deal because some of our previous reporting had resulted in import bans of goods produced through slave labor. So it was kind of this Malaysian, actually he was a former minister, who told us, look at America. He was right. I mean, we are doing the same thing. It's different, like a lot of people are not very sympathetic to prisoners versus migrants being trafficked, but ultimately it's very similar.
Yeah, and I think that was another big kind of light bulb that came on for us, because it was like, whoa, wait a minute. Our reporting on the seafood and the palm oil changed these laws. It changed the way that, shipments are seized, things, anything made with, and it was funny because I think normally us having been in Asia for so long, when a foreign ministry comes out on Twitter or anywhere and says anything about a story or you or AP, normally it is not a good thing. They are not happy. But the Chinese foreign ministry sent a tweet out after our story ran, and basically they didn't name names or anything, but they basically said, hey, you guys have been throwing stones at us over, prison labor and the Uyghur situation in China, but look at read this AP story and you can see what the U.S. is doing. So we were like, oh my goodness, the Chinese foreign ministry is actually putting a story out and telling people to read it, so it's a complete reversal of what we had been doing previously in Asia. But again, there was a lot of overlap there. One of the other things that we really wanted to look at, and I really, this was something that I was adamant that we dig deeply into, and that was again, when you're looking at the prisoners.
Go to work release. Talk about work release first.
And work release. Well, yeah, I mean, you've got the rights and protections are not the same for the American workers who are outside and those who are inside. And you could have 2 people standing side by side, out doing the same job in a community somewhere, but the prisoner doesn't have the same rights and protections.
Just for example of this, like what she's talking about is the work release. So we focused very heavily on Alabama and the work release programs, in addition to looking at who is buying directly from prisons or third-party suppliers. Prisoners are being sent into the community to work at fast food restaurants, foreign car manufacturers, furniture shops, and they'll go out for the day and then come back at night, and then basically they get paid for it, but there's often a huge cut in their wages. And while the DOC says, oh, this is helping with parole or this is all kind of ways they can save money. Some of the guys in Alabama, at least where we focused a lot of attention, were never going to get out of prisons. They had life without parole, and some of them were
had
murders, or like there were dangerous people who would technically be considered dangerous working alongside civilian employees at McDonald's. And it basically is just a way for Alabama, which has a long history with convict leasing, one of the worst, to continue to profit off this labor. And this is where you're getting in with the women now, I assume, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, and it's also, again, like we focused on, if somebody is hurt or killed, and we found some cases that were just absolutely horrific, and they might not be entitled to workers' comp. OSHA might not have jurisdiction, or the state agency that does, that's looking at workplace injuries or fatalities. There were all these things, they can't sue in the same way that a regular person on the outside could sue. It's very, very difficult. And we found example after example. I mean, I'll mention a couple of them. I mean, there was this one woman in Colorado, and her name was Candy. And she was on a work release. Robin interviewed her. And she was working at a sawmill. And a plank of wood got stuck, and she was told to go under and try to dislodge it. And the blade came to life. And it ripped into her skull. And she came up out of there, bleeding profusely, and they had no first aid there, so they stuck maxi pads on her head to try to stop the bleeding. And instead of, they couldn't even call 911. This is something where somebody gets a saw into their head, you call 911 for the ambulance, right? No, they did not take her to the hospital. They took her back to the prison where she was, stitched up and treated, and then got in a really horrific infection and ended up getting MRSA, and is still being years later.
Yeah.
I mean, Robin, you can talk about her a little bit. You interviewed her.
Yeah, I mean, she ended up getting put in solitary confinement because then they claimed that she was stealing a pair of underwear. I mean, they try to keep people separate, especially when something horrible happens, so that it cannot complain, cannot get additional help. And I mean, you've covered the worst of what happened to her, but she continues to really suffer. She's now convinced that people are kind of following her, and it's hard to really know what's true or not, because everything she claimed was happening in prison, actually, we were able to confirm. So I don't know. She's just it's a very horrible story, and not the only horrible story.
I was going to say, I mean, the people look to the firefighters, the wildland firefighters. They're essential, and we all know that prisoners are in those programs, right? And we found one young woman who died out in California, and we found a team of women in Nevada, who were forced, even though the fires were burning through their boots, they were forced to continue to work, and they got, second-degree burns, and they wouldn't take them to the hospital for their, injuries. And it was then they fought back. They got the ACLU involved in that particular case because they did it super early, because there's limitations on how long you have and all of these things. And they were able to fight back and actually got some change as a result of it. But I mean, the bottom line is,
Frank Ellington.
Yeah, we had a guy in Alabama who was working at a huge poultry plant, and he got sucked into a machine and killed instantly. So they're doing really dangerous jobs that no one else really wants to do. And then, of course, again, as I said, they're not given the same rights and protections. And so that was something that we really wanted to focus on. And then I'll also mention another story that we did. I think there were 5 stories in the package. We were looking at, particularly, it seems like we always end up having a story that looks at women, and we were looking at women who were working inside prisons and also on work release. And we found that women have they're particularly vulnerable to abuse, sexual abuse from guards. If these guards know that they are on work release, oftentimes when you're on work release, you might just have a few months left on your sentence. Well, these women are almost done. They want to get home to their kids, and the guards know this, and they take advantage of this, because if they try to abuse the women, and the women, report it or do anything, they know that the guards have ways of, making problems for them and adding time to their sentences. So what we found in all 50 states, again, we found cases of women who were working in the prison system being abused by guards. And we and I want to make this point too to the students out here. We found a particular case in West Virginia of a woman who was abused by a guy on work release, and she had pajamas that had DNA on them. And most of the cases, these guys are not prosecuted. Nothing happens at all. And in many cases, they're just allowed to quietly resign, and then they just move on to another facility, or they're transferred to another facility, and there's nothing in their record. And so this just continues on in other places. And in this particular case, we wove this story, this national story, around this really powerful narrative of this. It was actually, there were a number of women that were involved, but we talked to 2 of them. And I think for those of you who are thinking about, doing investigative reporting, I think what we found over the years is that you can have an amazing investigation, and it can, it can be really powerful. But if you don't have the storytelling and you don't have the writing, sometimes you're not gonna bring people in. So I think, like, one of the things that we try to always do, and in fact, I think sometimes we probably put more effort into the writing than the actual reporting, right? Like, we spend an enormous amount of time trying to make sure that the stories are, something that when you start to read it, you want to find out what happened to this person, right? Compelling. So I think as you're thinking about doing investigative reporting and crafting things, always remember that don't forget that the storytelling needs to be just as strong as the reporting. But anyway, with this rape story, in the narrative of this woman, the guy who was accused of doing this, he had been out. He was in the system, but he had been out. I think it was something like 8 years and not prosecuted. I mean, still just waiting. And finally, I guess a few weeks ago, he's just pleaded guilty. So that just happened. And I think things really kind of started, happening more after our story came out with that case.
Yeah, these are just a couple pictures. This is the guy who died in the, got pulled into the chicken slaughter machine. Ironically, he was working on the kill line where they kill the chickens, and he got sucked in, and that's his mother.
Wait, is that him? Is that Braxton?
Oh, is that Braxton?
That's
Braxton. Sorry, this guy. This is another guy who was working along the side of the highway, and he got hit by a car. And basically, he was a young man. I think he was 19 at the time. And this is his mother.
And oftentimes, nobody's told what really happens. There's just, little information, or they might not find out, or it's very frustrating for the loved ones when, you know, somebody dies on the job. This was a woman, and she was a woman in Arkansas who was working on a plantation, or that was working on a former plantation in the what it was called the Hoe Squad, and she was talking about how they were sexually harassed on a regular basis by the guards. And these are some of the old.
Yeah, this is where we tried to do kind of a back and forth between old pictures and current pictures to show the similarities.
That's in Florida, so we think this might be the only chain gang left in the U.S., or there might be another one or two somewhere else, but yeah, this was in Florida.
And here's this is Chandra McCormick, the woman we talked about in New Orleans.
We did a lot of reporting all over the country. So we were in the South. We did a lot of reporting in Arizona, where there was a big program involving an egg company, one of the biggest egg companies in the country, had a huge work release, or a program that was a direct contract with the DOC in Arizona.
Well, you can't really see it, but this is a map of the United States, all of the places that have agricultural programs. It was produced by professors in Colorado that were studying the same thing. And we're kind of wrapping up here. One thing we really like doing with all these stories is naming as many names as we can. So here's an example of that. It seems like some of these things are kind of strange, but so I think that's pretty much it. We can go a little into the impact. Several of the big companies cut ties after our story came out. There are lawyers in Louisiana that were looking at prison labor at Angola and other places, and successfully filed a lawsuit that I think was partially informed by our reporting, but they were working independently. As Margie said, the man accused of raping the woman in West Virginia he pled guilty.
He's pleaded guilty.
We don't know what
awaiting
yet.
sentencing.
Awaiting sentencing. What else was there?
Well, I mean, I think for us, one of the things that we really wanted to do with this project is we wanted to educate people. Mm-hmm. And I think that, a lot of states now, and also at the national level, the language from the 13th Amendment is in a lot of state constitutions. And there's been a big push to change that language, to pull that out of there, and also to change the 13th Amendment, that clause. And so I think that
Which was ultimately our goal. Like we often, our impact goals are often a little bit like just a shot at the moon, but it was like we want to get the 13th Amendment changed or have an amendment passed, and the same with the state constitutions. And we still think that could happen one day. Cory Booker was one of the main proponents for that.
I mean, and some of the states are still doing it. They're still changing. It's going to be a slow process, but I think that we wanted to have. I mean, I think with all of our projects, it's about the investigation, but it's also about the education.
Well, and if you're going to change laws, you need to have voters vote to change those laws. So if people don't understand and they're just hearing the state view of we're saving taxpayer dollars, or why this is help, if you're hearing only one side of it, you're going to quickly vote, keep them in there, let them work. What do we care? And just to touch on that, because I think one of the things we were most or worried about or knew was going to be an issue is there's going to be a lot of people who say these are prisoners, who cares, or and there's going to be other people who say, well, what's the solution, because we don't want taxpayers to pay for it. And I don't think there aren't that many people who say abolish the jobs altogether, but there is a feeling among many people, especially advocates in this area, You know, if you're going to hire them, make sure they're protected, make sure that they are treated with the same kind of human rights as outside workers, especially if they're benefiting these big companies.
And I just want to say before we end, I want to give props and a shout out to our editor, the great Kristen Gasley. And just so you all know, I mean, you heard Mike this morning and you saw his presentation. Kristen, while she was editing, and she had worked at AP for many, many years and has retired. She came out of retirement to work with us. She worked on the palm oil project with us.
And the seafood.
And the seafood.
Project.
But she also was the editor on Mike's project as well. So, you know, if you think that, you know, she should be here, I wish she was here right now, because she's an amazing editor, and we were so fortunate to have her. So.
I think that's it.
And yet we have questions for you. So, so thanks for that. I think it'd be interesting for some of the folks here, particularly the students. I think it's a dream job for many, or at least aspirational, to be a foreign correspondent. How did that happen for each of you?
Well, I went after grad school to Cambodia to start a newspaper, the first English language daily in Cambodia. So that was a country that was just recovering from war, and the publisher had a connection with the king that basically opened the door for us to start a paper. So I went for Cambodia Daily, which closed a couple years ago after political pressure, and then joined AP from there.
And Margie?
So it had been my dream. It was my dream job, and it had been my dream since I was very young. And I will mention my mentor, who has since passed, George Esper, who was the legendary AP war correspondent. You know, I wanted to go to Vietnam, and I wanted to figure out how to do that, and AP was something that I kind of learned early on. Okay, this is an avenue. So I went to AP straight after graduating from college, and I've been with AP for 26 years, I think now. And it was always, how do I get overseas? How do I do this? How do I get to Asia? And I just kept pushing. And I was telling a student last night, she said she wanted to go overseas, but she was a little frustrated because people had told her that, you know, that's not easy to do, you can't do this. And I said, you know, people did that to me too, and I just did it. Mm-hmm. I did it. It doesn't matter. Don't ever let anybody tell you can't do something.
And in some ways, I think you're able to leapfrog when you're overseas, because you might not go, and I know we both know so many people who went without a job and then just started stringing, and then suddenly we're stepping in and helping work for AP when the bureau chief left or something. I mean, I know so many people like that. So that for me was a leapfrog, just kind of go. I don't know, it would have taken forever to achieve anything here, I think, for me.
Yeah, I mean, I was at AP already, and then we had this path that we used to have to go to the international desk in New York, and people would get stuck there for years, and I didn't want to get stuck there. So they said, look, there's a job, but you're going to have to go as a local hire. And I just said, okay, I'll do it, done, right? So, I think just if you want something that seems like only like veteran reporters or, you know, people who, you know, just do it your own way.
Well, and we probably, or you probably ought to mention, Margie, you did work in Florida before you joined the AP, right?
Yeah, I worked at the Times-Union in Jacksonville for about a year. So I did leave AP for about a couple years actually, and then went back. And I did some really great stories here, and I've been able to reconnect, and Boltzell is back there. He was one of my editors in Jacksonville, and then went on to work at the AP, and I got some incredible experience there that I've carried with me over the years.
And talk just a little bit about impact. You had the slide up there with all of the brands. So were they all buying goods that were coming from prison labor? And are they all still buying goods? What do we know about that?
Those names were all indirect and direct buyers.
Part of the spider web.
Yeah, part of the spider web. So Cargill is the biggest privately owned company. They cut ties.
Trader Joe's.
Cut
ties.
McDonald's with the company that was buying eggs through Arizona company. So not all of them cut ties, but in some cases, the grain producers that provide, a lot of these cereals and other things, they quietly cut ties. So it's a mishmash, but I think ultimately we were able to tie companies that were buying hundreds of millions of dollars worth of goods from these prisons, trying to kind of figure out how much of those got cut is a little harder.
And then we had some contact after the stories came out from some Canadian researchers who said, hey, this is really interesting, and there's all this stuff that's coming into Canada, especially these car parts in Alabama that you've written about, and guess what? It's illegal for Canada to take stuff made in other countries from prison labor. So then, they have been in touch with me and have been, working on a report, and we'll see, if anything comes of that. I think with this one, everybody wants the impact to come right away, right? You want the impact to come the day that you write the story. It's like, okay, what's going to happen? And sometimes, an example is the seafood. That's been 10 years from now, and I still get things from people who are saying your reporting is still changing the way that we do things, and it's changing the way that we talk about this and deal with this. And there may be little things. Clearly, there's still a lot of slavery and human trafficking and things going on in palm oil and in the seafood industry. But I think now people can't say they don't know, right?
And I guess maybe one last question. Are there any state prison systems that have imposed some sort of safety standards for prison laborers or?
Kind of. Louisiana.
Well, that was the lawsuit.
It has agreed to put a little tent on the fields so that the guys can go for a 15-minute break every couple of hours, but I think there were reports that those tents, that's just a ridiculous thing, right? Like
they agreed to give them water and
gloves and
sunscreen.
Right.
But it was but it was the first time that a judge had ordered that anything
Yeah,
be
it's
done,
remarkable
right?
that anything happens in Louisiana and kind of recognizes that this is abusive and inhumane in prisons. But that's the only one I think that, and Hickman's.
Oh yeah, we had heard that they're no longer, but I don't know. I think there were some issues with bird flu was also, because it was a egg farm out in Arizona that we focused heavily on. And I think that they are no longer doing the program. That's what I heard anyway, but I don't know how much that's related to the bird flu stuff too.
Well, thank you both.
Thank you.
And congratulations.